Get on the train before it leaves the station. The truth train is coming, gonna run them down, run them down.
Hello there, folks. How you doing? Okay, today we're here talking a little bit about Melissa Caluzinski. For those of you who don't know, this is another case that Kathleen Zellner is working on. I've done some videos about it. I'll go ahead and link those below in the description below. What it is a case where Melissa, who was a daycare worker, was convicted of throwing a toddler to the ground in such a way that exactly the back of his head hit the ground, like virtually before any other part of his body, and that this is how the child ended up dying from this injury. And there's a lot of things I'm going to go through here as I talk about this, just to give those a little bit of information who don't know about this already. So the first thing you want to know about this case is probably the fact that there were x-rays taken and some TIFF, what are called TIFF images, about the damage to Ben's skull. Ben is the child, the deceased, the victim in this case, essentially. Or as it may be, it may have just been an accidental death. And so that's Ben, and there were x-rays and TIFFs. Thing is that what was handed over to the defense was all darkened out and basically unreadable. So the defense didn't have the proper, what they needed to effectively argue against what the state was claiming. There's there's a lot of really weird things about this case, and as I was reading this, what's going on with Melissa's case right now is Zellner has filed for a writ of habeas corpus, with the federal courts, and she filed a motion, already once, asking for a writ of habeas corpus. What I read today was the state's response to it, and what's interesting is when they go through the facts of the case, they talk about the fact that, number one, Ben was prone to, in a sitting position, would just throw his head back and himself back, and was actually having to go to the doctor because he was having some symptoms. The doctors basically decided it wasn't serious because he wasn't vomiting, which is what happens with a serious head injury. There will be vomiting. But they all just kept, apparently, according to what's being, reported as fact at the trial here, is that they were all saying, oh, but there was nothing wrong with him, he was fine, he was, whatever. And it could be that they were just figuring, he's a kid, he's, his body's going to heal, he's going to be fine, or whatever. But the problem is that this kid obviously was, unfortunately, having some kind of a temper issue, and then he was throwing his head back because he wanted to show whoever it was in authority that was, wanting him to do something he didn't necessarily want, or, whatever it is. Because in the state's fact-finding here, they talk about the fact, well, let me put it this way. Ultimately, I think about just a couple days before Ben ended up dying over at daycare, he had gone to the hospital because he was vomiting. He went to the hospital, and they kind of checked him out or whatever, and the doctor said, okay, we'll keep him home from daycare tomorrow, and they did. And he started to get better again, right? And then they took him to daycare the next day, and what they describe as happening is that he got there in the morning, he was fine. And then around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there's a shift change between the regular, the morning, or I don't know, the early crew or the early teacher, and it hands over to a Miss Cassinger, I believe it is, Caluzinski, or I'm sorry if I'm butchering that, but it handed over to her. And what it describes is that the kids were having snacks and stuff, and then I guess as we're finishing up their snacks and stuff, they were getting a little bit rambunctious or whatever kind of thing, right? And so they were rounding the kids up to wash their hands and that sort of thing, right? And I'm just imagining how that would be something that might trigger a kid to throw a temper tantrum, because they were having fun and they didn't want to go wash their hands, right? So, I mean, this strikes me as odd, but in their own description, they talk about how the petitioner, which is Melissa, left the room right after they were done cleaning the kids up or whatever. She left the room. This Miss Cassinger, I believe it is there, and she takes Ben and from I guess up on some kind of a platform or something where he was washing his hands, and set him down onto the floor. Okay, Ben's in diapers, and sets him down onto the floor. She said she didn't see it, but she didn't see if his head hit the tile, but she saw him throw himself back. And then she picked him up and was like, and heard him start to cry. Okay? And heard him start to cry when he did it. And then she picked him up, I guess, to examine him and stuff like that, and she looked aside for a second to get something, and when she looked back, he was laying down again. And then it says how she went and took him in a bouncy swing or whatever, and right around that time, Melissa was walking back into the room. And that's the way they describe. That's the facts described in the beginning of this document. So it's very interesting, because then it goes into talking about the interrogation, where Melissa is essentially saying, I don't know what happened. Maybe Miss Cassinger. It's what it's coming down to. She's saying maybe something that the other teacher did, because I don't know. I came into the room and noticed he was sluggish and lethargic, and I was getting concerned, but she didn't know what happened. And it would be consistent with what is described as the facts in the case at the beginning of this document. So, for those of you who are wondering, I'll try to go ahead and cover this and go a little more closer and get some screenshots for you guys to see some of the arguments here. I'll try to do that for you guys this weekend. But this was really, really interesting stuff. And so what it comes down to is they're basically, I mean, there's all these things. So it's like I said, the altered X-ray and TIFF images that were handed over at trial, which were unreadable, which it now has been found out that some doctoring occurred to make that happen. And the only person who was able to correct it was one of the creators of the software, Tiger whatever it is, Tiger Watch or something. One of the creators and co-founders of that company, or that software company or whatever, had to actually come in to be able to fix it. That's what had to. They didn't bring in some computer programmer, some guy who's into visual whatever, right? Like the defense did. Just some, kind of average, ordinary, computer visual, guy, right? No, they went out and got the guy who actually was part of making the software, and he was able to make it work. I'm thinking I'd find this much more convincing if the state got somebody who wasn't actually, likely to know that software better than anybody, because that's what, it's his company, right? Anyway, or it was his company. Anyways, it doesn't matter. He was very familiar with it, to say the least. So, I don't know that really proves anything. That means that somebody who's very adept at using Tiger Watch or whatever can do wild things. But nobody else was able to make that happen, so it tells me it must be difficult. But anyway, so we got all these issues with those X-rays and TIFFs and everything, and how they were altered and blackened out, basically to where they're black. You can't see what's going on at all in them because they're black, right? And what it's come down to in the end is somehow in the software they were able to get to this menu, to this thing where they were able to play with the some aspect of the light in whatever, the backlight or something or whatever, to where then they were able to do as that one guy did on the stand. I think it took somebody watching him, work the software maybe to get an idea of what to do. And I'm thinking that this software isn't exactly easy to use. But, alright, so you have all these issues with the case. Obviously, this kid has a history of throwing himself back and hitting his head. There's, the doctors are talking about that he most likely had a subdural hematoma that did not occur on the day he died. He had a subdural hematoma that had partial healing. It was starting to heal. And what seems like the general consensus is that he had suffered a subdural hematoma, possibly from slamming his head into the ground, maybe throwing himself back one time, and that created one, but it was maybe minor, and eventually stopped bleeding, and he started to feel better, and so he wasn't having any symptoms. And then they're theorizing that, as can happen sometimes if it gets aggravated, or if he's a kid and he's just playing around and or something, and it started to bleed again. If he did, they're theorizing that would explain his symptoms that he had kind of the 2 weeks previous to with the weeks leading up to Ben's death, that he had these symptoms that were kind of reoccurring. They're believing that that's all from a subdural hematoma from the original injury that Ben suffered. And that makes sense because it's documented that he was, having these problems and these symptoms, ultimately culminating into 2 days before he died, ultimately to where he was vomiting, which is what the doctors were saying was the real sign that he had a subdural hematoma. But because he wasn't exhibiting it earlier, they were kind of like, okay, it's okay, he's fine. And like I said, they probably figure he's young, he'll heal, he's a kid, his healing ability is off the charts, in a sense, just like, because that's what it means to be a kid. Your ability to heal is just off the charts compared to what adults endure when they get injured, right? Anyway, so this is the problem with it, is that it truly looks, and according to the facts as stated at the beginning of this argument, it looks like Ben unfortunately hurt himself, and it's tragic and it's sad, but it's only made more tragic by the fact that the police deliberately went against that narrative, held Melissa for a ridiculously long time, questioning her until she eventually broke down and said what they wanted her to say because she thought it would get her out of there, which it didn't. Oh, and don't forget, the state has AEDPA on their side, just as with Brendan, as is with Caluzinski. I actually maybe wonder if that was part of maybe Zellner's reasoning to file a writ of habeas corpus with Melissa. Seeing that Brendan got so far, maybe she figured there was a shot. So I think this case is ridiculous, what they did to Melissa. I think it's insanely obvious that this, Ben, the child Ben, was clearly, his way of throwing a temper tantrum was to throw his head back, and I think he was banging his head sometimes. And he may have been re-aggravating that injury. It may have been re-bleeding on its own, as some of the experts said can happen. Whatever it is, he was continually showing the symptoms of it over and over again. And then they would go away, but then they would come back. And then they would go away, and then they would come back, ultimately until the day where we have this report where Miss Cassinger, I think it is, saw him throw his head back but didn't see if his head hit the ground, the tile floor. So anyway. So I just wanted to point that out, though. AEDPA, is on the state side here, and Zellner's got to fight against that strong current. So, just thought I'd point that out. And so, this is another one of Miss Zellner's cases. It's, this one's interesting to me because I seriously, when you look at the facts in this case, it's amazing that she was convicted in the first place. I mean, it's to me, it's just beyond. Especially when, like I said, and I'll show you guys this weekend. I'll go in and I'll show you some of the state's response to the petition for habeas, writ of habeas corpus, and I'll show you some more of these things. I'll show you some of these things that I'm actually talking about. But yeah, it's going to be interesting, I think, to watch what's going to happen here. Obviously, now we can expect a reply from Zellner on this, and so we'll get to see what Zellner has to say about this current filing that I've read today. One more thing to add. One more thing that to add to this is there's also a letter that was filed today. It's a letter from somebody petitioning the court to be able to file an amicus brief in favor of Melissa Caluzinski, and this person is claiming that they have new evidence that wasn't brought up by the defense or the state at trial, and that they would like leave to be able to file a amicus brief with the court in regards to this evidence that was ignored, I guess. So there's nothing in there about an answer to it or what's happened with it or anything. It just shows that there's a letter that's filed asking to be able to file an amicus brief, and the person does say they're a paralegal and not a lawyer, but that they've been working, as a paralegal and I think in a law firm, they said, and all that sort of. But I'll show you guys that too this weekend when I get a chance to sit down and really get some documents and set it up for you. But anyway, interesting stuff for those of you who are interested in Zellner's other cases and stuff. Melissa Caluzinski is a good one to follow. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe. We'll see you.